Good afternoon. Welcome to Gordon Library, and thank you so much for joining us here today. We are very excited to welcome Professor Jennifer McWeeny from WPI and Professor Keya Maitra from UNC Asheville. Professors McWeeny and Maitra will be discussing their groundbreaking new book, Feminist Philosophy of Mind, which delineates a new field of feminist philosophy of mind by offering the first sustained treatment of issues in philosophy of mind from feminist perspectives. The book includes integrative and interdisciplinary methodologies, a wide range of contributors, and engagement with multiple kinds of diversity. Professors McWeeny and Maitra will begin with a presentation of their book, followed by a question and answer session with you, the audience. Please note that today's event is being recorded, and we will be posting the event on the library's YouTube channel. Please help yourself to refreshments. And Professor McWeeny and Maitra, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paige. And we just wanted to start by thanking Paige Newman and the Gordon Library staff for putting this together. It's really wonderful. We started this book 10 years ago, so we've been working on it for quite a long time. And so it's so nice that when a book comes out, the institution wants to hear about it and talk about it. And so we're going to, if you've never heard of philosophy of mind before, or philosophy or feminist philosophy, that's fine. We're hoping that we can give you a little insight into what we talk about in the book and just have a conversation about ideas at the end. We also wanted to thank our contributors. There are 20 contributors in the book from all over who really helped to put this book together. And of course, I want to thank Keya, we've seen, we've met almost weekly for 10 years and so I probably see Keya more than most people in my life. And it's been such a pleasure to work with her. And I'm so glad that she was able to join us here at WPI for this book talk. So I'll let Keya begin.
Well, thank you, Jen, for that introduction. Yes, I feel that way too about, for me, Zoom. And if Jen is not on Zoom, then I'm like, something is not right. But thank you, Paige, and thank you all for coming. So we will, because we want to have as much time as possible for Q&A. So let's just jump in. So what we were thinking we would do as a sort of a opening exercise is have you think about 3 questions, and I'm going to time ourselves. I'm going to give ourselves 2 minutes. So after I tell you the 3 questions, and what we would like you to do is just jot down or think about whatever thoughts come to your mind when you think about these 3 questions. So first one is, does your mind have a gender, right? Second one, when you think of your gender identity, how is your mind involved? And then the final one is, are racial categories more about bodies or minds? So no right or wrong answers we are looking for. We are just looking to get you think about these things. And then what we would like to do is at the end of our presentation, we'll bring these questions back. And one of the ways that we can get started in the discussion is to see how your responses have been shifted or impacted as a result of listening to our talk. So I'm going to stop talking and start my 2 minutes. Okay. So after the 2 minutes is over, I'm going to say, okay, 2 minutes is over. So you have about 30 more seconds. So whatever, if you're thinking, writing things down, bring it to a close, or, even thoughts. So. Okay, 2 minutes are over. So we'll now jump into the presentation. Thank you for participating in this.
So just very quickly to give you a sense of where we're headed, we want to talk personally how we came up with the book, a little bit about the subfield of philosophy, feminist philosophy of mind, the methods we used in the book, methods and topics, and then some future directions. So should give you a taste. So I'll let Keya begin.
All right. Thanks, Jen. Yeah. So a little bit about myself and how I came to this project. I grew up in India and I really fell in love with philosophy in high school. My high school offered philosophy classes. And I studied philosophy through university in India before coming to the US for my second PhD at University of Connecticut. There I studied with, professor, eminent philosopher of mind and philosopher of language, Ruth Garrett Millikan, whose important contributions to philosophy include the proposal to understand language as a biological category. So initially I was focused on, for both of my PhD dissertations, I was focused on topics and philosophies of mind and language. However, after graduate school, as I was navigating my life of a teacher, a mother, an immigrant to, and then permanent resident of the United States, I found the analytical concepts of feminism really helpful, germane in making sense of much of my experiences that I were, having to navigate. Initially, this resulted in two distinct areas of philosophical interest for me. One was the cross-cultural philosophy with special focus on philosophy of mind, and the other was, third world feminism, transnational feminism, that I was becoming more interested. Soon enough, though, the potential of engaging with these two, which was initially disparate for me, two areas together dynamically became quite apparent. And it will also happen to be that it was around that same time that Jen and we'll talk more about how this particular project at NEH Institute, we started working on it. So this was when I was wanting to bring these two fields together. That's when Jen and we started our conversation. And then 10, 11 years later, we have the book. So Jen, yeah.
Thank you, Keya. So interestingly, I came to this kind of from the other direction as Keya. I was an ardent feminist in high school and reading all kinds of feminist literature and went to college for biology, conservation biology, and just ended up steering over to philosophy by graduate school. And I was really interested in ethics and ethical questions. I went to Australia to find Peter Singer to talk about animal ethics, this like a young undergrad. And I really wanted to deal with questions of environmental ethics, animal ethics, social ethics. but the more I started studying ethics, the more I thought, well, wait a second, but how do we know these things? You know, how do we know what's right and what's wrong, and how do we move as people in the world? So I turned to epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, and was studying in graduate school at the University of Hawaii, cross-cultural philosophy. And then I went to the University of Oregon to study feminist epistemology there. They had one of the strongest feminist programs. And the more I studied epistemology, theories of knowledge, the more I thought, well, wait a second, how does the mind work? What is the mind? And that's how I got into thinking about the mind. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but one of the frustrations I had with some of the standard ways philosophy of mind is thought about is it really didn't get into the particularity and personality of experience. And so I was led to phenomenology, which is this European tradition that does really focus on first-person experience. So, and then Keya and I met in 2006 and have worked together since, and we'll talk a little bit now about our process of conceiving the book. So Keya and I met in 2006, but we then rejoined in 2012 at this NEH seminar called Investigating Consciousness, Buddhist and Contemporary Philosophical Perspectives. So we were both working in cross-cultural philosophy, and this was a fantastic setting to work in interdisciplinary work about the mind and cross-cultural work about the mind. But what Keya and I noticed at the seminar with all of these great thinkers in philosophy of mind and Buddhist studies, there was Dave Chalmers was there, Mark Sideritz, Dan Zahavi, Susanna Siegel, Jay Garfield, all of these faculty. Not one critical social perspective was represented in this seminar. So Keya and I talked a lot about that, and we said we should do something. We should bring these fields together. Keya, did you want to add to that?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think I just only, I mean, the addition is, remember, we would have, because the way that these institutes are run, there are faculty, that, the host faculties and then faculty rotate in and out. And remember, Jen, we would go and talk to the faculty and we would say, hey, what about, some of the feminist concerns? And they would be like, oh, never thought about it. Yes, wouldn't that be such an interesting thing? So, it wasn't that, in some ways we were encouraged, but we were also kind of surprised by the absence of, this kind of thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So go ahead, Keya.
Yeah. So as we were talking, as we worked more and developed the book in general, but especially also the introduction, we realized that we had to define what we meant by feminist philosophy of mind. So I'm going to read from the slide. Feminist philosophy of mind is an area of study that investigates the nature of mind with reference to social locations marked by categories such as gender, race, class, sexuality, nationality, and ability, and or investigates that nature of social locations with reference to theories about the mind. So the conviction of this definition is reflected in numerous places in the organizational decisions that Jen and I made about this book. For example, the title of our first section is mind, and as you can see on the board, mind and gender, ampersand, race, and instead of calling it, mind and gender and race, and so on and so forth, where the various social locations are treated individually and as isolated categories, we wanted to embrace a robustly intersectional understanding of social location. So this allowed us also to sidestep the need to prioritize one social location over other, almost arbitrarily. So that's how I think you could see how our definition influence some of our decisions. So yeah, Jen, I know you have something to add.
So we spent a long time, over a year, coming up with this gender and race and symbol to express what we wanted to talk about, because, and we talked with many of the contributors as well of the book, because often what happens in feminist theorizing is gender gets prioritized, and what gender means is white women primarily. And so we wanted to signal that we were rejecting this unthinking prioritization of gender in feminist analysis, but also giving different possibilities for the way that gender and race and other categories are connected. So different theorists will say different things, from two separate categories to mutually constitutive and intertwined categories. And so you see gender and race are together, but they're still separate. So it gives a kind of opening for what we wanted to talk about. So now we'll go through this somewhat quickly, because we want to talk about we want to leave a lot of time for discussion, but there were several early anthologies, feminist anthologies, and for show and tell, I brought some of the old books that you can see I read a lot here. This is some of the early work in feminist philosophy saying feminism isn't just about social and political and ethical questions. It's also about these core fundamental questions about what a mind is, what a person is, how does knowledge work. And as early as 1981, we have Anvil Dua and Moraga's This Bridge Called My Back, which is radical writings by women of color, and really opens the question of, well, what is the mind? What is an emotion, for example, when a woman of color is having an emotion? Is that different than when other people are having an emotion? Or what is the mind? And so these anthologies are precursors to the formal field, feminist philosophy of mind. It includes some really excellent articles in that area, and some of them explicitly name the idea of feminist philosophy of mind, like Gary and Purcell's, and the more recent feminist philosophy. So then what this slide shows you, and it's a really interesting question as we were setting up this subfield, is we noticed that in philosophy, you start getting feminist subfields of each area of philosophy early on in the 90s, and feminist philosophy really starts to blossom in the 90s. But look at what comes first. So you get feminist ethics by Claudia Card, and then feminist epistemologies, and then, oh, I'm sorry, that must have come on. Is that right? Okay. And feminist epistemologies, feminist aesthetics as early as 1995, bioethics, feminist philosophy of science, ecofeminism coming in the 90s, feminist philosophy of religion, metaphysics, feminism and the history of philosophy. And it's not until 2022 that you get philosophy of mind, feminist philosophy of mind. Why so late? Why did it take 30 years for there to be a kind of formal recognition of this? And I think Keya might have something to say about that.
Yeah, and Jen, I just wanted to point out that your your video came on. Okay.
I don't know what happened, but
that's all right. So yeah, while we were working, one particular piece I read by a philosopher called David Columbia, and he had written that he was also considering this question: why is philosophy of mind such a kind of recalcitrant, right? It's so opposed to, almost it felt, the traditional philosophy of mind for any kind of questions from feminism and other, critical race theory or something. And he wrote this word, this phrase, most heavily guarded fortresses of philosophy. He said, most likely philosophy of mind is, if not one of, maybe the most heavily guarded fortresses of philosophy. And therefore, this was where philosophers thought that this is the core of philosophy, and therefore not allowing any kind of contamination, as it were. So you guys can kind of appreciate what we were up to, right? What we were trying to accomplish in doing this.
Yes, and so let's see, there we go. And Keya is going to talk about some of the early topics in feminist philosophy of mind leading up to the anthology areas that were covered significantly by feminists early on.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Yes, so, what was interesting for us is, therefore, given that what we were up against, it was important for us to, in some ways, document that we were not working in a vacuum, or that we were not starting from scratch, that actually there are topics and areas that both where there were the interest from philosophers of mind, traditional philosophers of mind, and feminist philosophers have overlapped, and there were contributions from this. So, for example, the nature of the self, right? Is the self unitary? Is the self, continuous? Is the self discontinuous? Those kinds of questions. Self and identity, those questions about emotions, different emotions, their natures. And it's also interesting that sometimes philosophers of mind would have come later to a question than feminist philosophers, but there were definitely noticeable overlaps in the interests of trauma and women's psychology, embodiment. Definitely, I think feminist philosophers were for the first, but even the more we thought about cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and all, embodiment were important topics, perception, consciousness raising. So these were some of the areas where there were, shared interest, but what we were not seeing was really a systematic cross-pollination, right? Yes, on to you, Jen.
And so these are just some of the early articles that were defining for our field, and we could list 30 more of these articles by feminists: Naomi Shaman, Marilyn Frye, Audre Lorde, Marie Lugonis, all four of those actually writing excellent articles on anger in the early 80s, and how anger is different for women and men, people of color, and theorizing that. Bartkey talking about feminist consciousness in the 90s, memory by Bryson, and neurofeminism. So here are some general questions that come up from the emergence of a feminist philosophy of mind as opposed to traditional philosophy of mind. Oftentimes, traditional philosophers of mind approach the question of mind with a universalism. Let's identify the universal features of minds across all bodies or all people. And what feminist philosophy of mind really does is says, wait a second, let's be more choiceful about this. Maybe it's not the case that minds are always the same, or faculties of mind like perception, memory, emotion are always the same across different bodies. So we're looking at particular groups. And as I was saying at the beginning, first person experience of people, and how does that square with theories? Another thing, it's a favorite thing of philosophers of mind traditionally to talk about interspecies minds. So we have Nagel's famous article, What is it like to be a bat? Trying to think about bat experience. And also a lot of work on artificial intelligence. What is it like to be a machine? Would a machine have consciousness? But the strange thing is, and feminists like Bryson and James have pointed this out, we have all these groups of people and interspecies groups of people that raise very interesting questions looking across different genders, different races. So Sylvia Winter, in response to Nagel and Chalmers, wrote an article, what is it like to be Black? Right. And so there's all of these interesting questions that aren't getting asked in the traditional category. And Keya is going to talk some more about this.
Yeah, so, as you can tell, especially following from the first general question that Jen mentions, the moment you are at least becoming mindful of that, mind is not attributed or mind is not experienced, right? One way by everyone, right? It's not an universal category, then whose minds are the subjects and the models and objects of theorizing becomes important, right? And then the other question also that was important is sort of more related to point 2 that Jen was talking about. So philosophers of mind, traditional philosophers of mind are very they love these thought experiments. So you already hear, a zombie kind of thought experiment, but another kind of thought experiment that philosophers of mind and language use is called the twin earth, a thought experiment. So quickly speaking, what they would do is, imagine another earth, which is just like our earth, right? But certain features are different. And on the basis of this hypothetical scenario that we are asked to imagine, then arguments are made about the nature of mind and mental phenomena on the basis of this imagined reality, right? Hypothetical reality, without even wondering whether that kind of possibility is viable, right? If the hypothesis is viable at all. So one of the questions for us was, what if actually, instead of drawing our arguments from thought experiments, what if we actually drew our arguments from the experience of actual people with actual minds? So that was also another question for us.
Yes. So we'll
Yeah,
start us
I
off
will.
talking.
Yeah, so one of the things that we needed to do, as you can tell, given our general questions, is to identify early on what our methods were. And I think it was also, as we in the process of identifying, we also realized that most of our actually contributors were also consciously thinking about these questions. So what is the mind? Whose mind is the model for the theory, and to whom is mind attributed? And I would just say one other thing, which is that for us, another sort of significant decision, I would say, right, Jen, is to treat these questions collectively and not individually or separately. So I'll turn it over to you, Jen. Yeah.
And just as an example that we give in the introduction of these 3 different questions, usually traditional philosophy of mind just focuses on number 1 and doesn't look at the other context of mind. And so we have René Descartes famously saying, I exist as long as I am thinking, asserting his own existence in the act of thinking. Simone de Beauvoir comes in and says, but wait a second, before I even get to the process of thinking, I have to say I am a woman, because I'm not read in the same way that Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Descartes and all of these other French philosophers are. And then Sojourner Truth, and Bell Hooks interprets this in her book of this title, says, ain't I a woman? So before we even make claims about ourselves, we have a Black woman saying, why is there skepticism about whether I have a mind or a gender or what I'm doing? So these are the issues we're trying to treat collectively rather than separately. And here are just some of the topics that we cover in the 20 chapters. It's quite a long book with a lot of, we try to, comprehensively cover many of the issues in the field. And maybe Keya, do you want to say something about your own chapter in the book, your excellent chapter on mental content?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Yeah, so I know I realize it's 31, so we'll finish soon. So in my chapter, it's mental content. So what I'm working with the existing literature in in philosophy of mind. Content gets a lot of attention from philosophers of mind, and externalism is a theory, okay, which says that what we think, what our thoughts are about. That's what typically we mean by mental content. What our thoughts are about depend at least partially on how the world turns out, right? So what our thoughts about is not determined entirely by what goes on inside of our head or inside of oneself. So that's externalism. I develop an externalist more often, feminist externalist account, where I say that it's not just enough to take the world, but how the world impacts, like how our socioeconomic and say other social conditions impact what we think. It has to be taken into account in our theorizing. And I make another point is that we realize the more we think about mental content that many of our words, we would like them to have a different or at least evolved meaning. And so I develop a theory of account, which mental content, which I argue can accommodate that kind of transformative motivation. Okay, and Jen, your great chapter.
I'll just say quickly, my chapter is about mental attribution, and it's about it really breaks down in detail the ways that we attribute and disattribute, take away mentality to social groups in history, and also how we objectify people, make them into things, say they have less mentality than other people. And so I look at mental attribution and put that in dialogue with contemporary conversations about panpsychism, the idea that everybody in the world has a mind, that the earth has a mind, that the environment has a mind, and show that some traditional philosophers of mind have kind of, I think they've made some missteps in how they think about panpsychism by what we learned from the social theory about mental attribution and attributing minds to different things and different people. So I think in the interest of time, we'll just show you the last slide about future engagements, but I think this is just the first step, and we're hoping that a lot of research gets done that expands much beyond the 20 chapters that we have in the book. So with that, we'll thank you for your attention and bring you back to some of the questions that we asked you in the beginning. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Professors McWeeny and Professor Maitra, for that engaging talk. We will now take questions from the audience. If you are here in person, you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you are on Zoom, you can type your question in the chat and I'll read it aloud to the room. Or if you're on Zoom, if you prefer to ask your question aloud, raise your hand and I can unmute you. Keep in mind, again, this event is being recorded and we will post it on our YouTube channel, just in case that influences how you want to ask your question. And we'll try to alternate between questions in the room and questions from people on Zoom. And I also understand some of you may have 1 o'clock commitments, so if you need to sneak out a little early, that's okay.
Congratulations on a splendid book. I looked at some of it. I actually read some of it. I want to make 2 very quick observations and then raise a question which I'm very confused about myself. First thing is you seem to alternate between traditional philosophy of mind and feminist philosophy of mind. I'm wondering why you didn't just say sexist philosophy of mind, because that would seem to be that is one way of conceiving it. The other thing is, it's very interesting to me, the overlap that is good, quite good, between feminist philosophy of mind and feminist psychology that's been generated to talk about emotion, theories of the self, all that kind of stuff. is very prevalent in the Wellesley Stone Center, a lot of other psychologists, feminist psychologists. So the overlap in that direction, but also the overlap in fiction. We're going to talk about representing concrete minds. How do you do that? Well, psychiatrists could write a memo or you could write a novel. So that's that. So I was wondering about this. It's very clear that this stuff about social location are collective facts about people, your race, your gender, all that sort of thing. But the net result seems to be quite obviously that there's a person there with a mind of some kind or other, shaped this way, that way. Is there any such thing as a collective mind? If you think of the insanity that's sweeping over the globe in countless different ways now, if you think of mirror neurons, if you think of the effect of neurological colonization of the internet and cell phones on people's minds, is there any sense in which we can conceive of a collective mind, which is therefore capable of collectively mentally deteriorating to insanity? I don't know. So I'm really asking.
And Jen, if you might, could you repeat that last part of the question? We're having a little trouble on the Zoom.
Okay.
Questions come through.
Sure. And I don't know if you want to move that into the room, that might help. But the question, there are a lot of good comments about the overlap between feminist psychology and feminist philosophy of mind. And also the question is can we think of a collective mind, especially with the state of the world today and people moving to different areas, moving to kind of similar thoughts in certain ways. And Keya, I guess I can start this since I work on panpsychism. So this is a big question about whether experience can be shared. And Dan Zahavi, working in Copenhagen and at Oxford, is one of the people who is theorizing we experience right now. And he actually takes the negative view that what you really have is two individuals. And, there may be a coincidence, but their perspectives are individuated. And I actually argue against Zahavi and have done this, in person with him. He's one of my favorite thinkers, but also I don't agree with everything he says. That actually in certain cases, especially certain pathological cases, that experience can be shared. And I have an article called Flesh Possessed. And William James has this great book called Exceptional Mental States, where he's talking about hypnosis, possession, dreams, exorcism, which I think these are really interesting mental states to think about. And like if you have a situation of an alcoholic family with extreme codependency, the child usually knows what the parents are going to do before the parents do. So what kind, so in a sense, they already have the perspective. So I think that, we are relational, and that's something that feminist philosophy of mind, all of the authors in the book argue, is that minds are relational, they're not individuated. And when you have a kind of pathology or sickness that's going on in culture, that affects people and they start to share consciousness, especially when they're using what Clark and Chalmers have called the extended mind, which is computers and phones and notebooks and things. When the extended mind is the same, that also gives a kind of collective consciousness. But Keya, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I loved your answer, and also the question about collective mind. And I must say that the only one point I want to add to that would be that Jen mentioned the relational nature of our reality, and I also work in Buddhist philosophy, where I am very convinced by the Buddhist claim that interdependence is ontologically primary, and independence is actually more illusory than. But what I would say about, so collective mind, of course, is important concept, but as feminist philosophers would say, we cannot assume the collectiveness, right? We have to work at it. And in order to work at it, we have to acknowledge the individualities of the minds, right? So that's how I would say, yes, collective mind is a very important concept, but it needs to be thought not so much as a kind of already happening, but that at something that we work at constantly and repeatedly. Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any questions from people on Zoom? Oh, yes, we do. All right, Peter Hansen has a question. Can you get close to the mic? Similar question. Elon Musk recently compared Twitter to a hive mind, more powerful because collective. This was criticized on Twitter by comparison to neurological research. How would you summarize the perspective of your book for Elon Musk? Answers are longer than a tweet are allowed, an opportunity to promote your book on Twitter.
Well, one thing, okay, so I can start, Keya, with this. So one of my favorite books, and I think a very underread book, is by a man named Simon Charlesworth, and it's called The Phenomenology of Working Class Experience. And this is something that I don't think we've developed enough in the book, but it's something I'm getting into more, is working class studies and the way that the working class actually has very different notions of time than the wealthy class. Like a working class person will not show up late to something. Wealthy people are late constantly. You know, these are things that Charlesworth points out in the book, that actually the perception, temporality, some of these ontological things are different because the habits of working class people are different. So the question is, and then so that's one thing to think about, how wealthy Elon Musk is, and if he would even be able to access the kind of variation and social location perspective that we're talking about. And then this also reminds me of Janine Jones's chapter in the book called Disappearing Black People Through White Empathy. And the way that empathy is very difficult when you're not attributing equivalent minds to different social groups. So if you're not thinking of a person on the same level as you, it's very hard to empathize with that person and get into that person's perspective. So again, my initial thoughts are, I'm not sure Elon Musk would, hear it, but I see what Peter's doing is he's giving us a chance to give a one sentence something to Twitter to promote the book, right? Where we would say, it's really something about taking the individuality of social location into account when talking about the mind.
Yes, perfect. Beautifully said, Jen. I will just say, I'll take Peter's challenge and say, hive mind needs feminist philosophy of mind.
Great, Keya. Excellent.
I always have things to say, other people aren't.
Move the
Student. Yeah, why don't you put that in the middle? Because I can speak, I can project to it.
I'm just wondering, in terms of what you just last said, Jen, it's hard to empathize with somebody unless you think they're on the same level. I wonder about that. Can't you empathize with a 4-year-old?
Yes, I think, but I think in that case, you would be thinking on the same level in terms of the value of personhood. And I think across racial difference historically and across gender difference historically, it's not thought that Simone de Beauvoir, for example, talks about how women are associated with their reproductive capacities. And so they're not attributed a mind actually in any meaningful sense. They're thought to think with their hormones. Whereas men are, even though they also have hormones, are thought to think with their mind, right? So I think that's part of Jones's argument, which I think is one of the, really, all of the chapters are interesting, but that's one that we keep coming back to because it's making such an intervention in empathy across social groups. And I also want to make sure, I think someone in the back also had a question, but Keya, go ahead.
I just add one thing is that you see, I think what and Jen, you were absolutely right, and what Janine Jones is doing is actually also asking us to consider what is involved in our ability to empathize. We tend to think of ability to empathize in kind of this abstract mental term. But if we think about really, if we take these racial and other social categories seriously, then ability to empathize becomes a lot more nuanced, embodied, in fact, actually social experience. And in that sense, it would depend on which 4-year-old you're talking about. So, yeah.
Stretch his microphone.
So I understand your book is about how like different people in different social positions have different like meaning for what it is to have a mind, and like the nature of mind is different across social positions. But I assume you're not making that like an essentialist claim, right? Like when you're born, you are not yet working class, you are not yet a woman, right? That's something society does to you. So I guess in your theory, when does that happen? If, yeah.
So that's a great question. And actually what we're talking about is when we're theorizing about what a mind is, it's important to take, okay, you just disappeared. It's important to take into account these different social locations. Otherwise, we're going to get a very narrow view of what a mind is. Now, of course, neither Keya nor I are essentialists, and we spend a lot of time refuting that idea. But this gets very complicated in philosophy of mind and we actually, we do this in the introduction. So Dave Chalmers in traditional philosophy of mind has this famous phrase called the hard problem of consciousness, which is about how do we express something that's experiential in physical terms. Keya and I riff off that a little bit and say the hardest problem for feminism is to try to explain how the material conditions of our lives shape our consciousness. And so for me, I'm a Merleau-Ponty person, French phenomenology, who thinks that the mind is, that the body is the mind. And so that bodily habits cultivate certain perceptions, certain perspectives. So if you engage in a certain habit over and over and over again, you can actually, your mind is plastic and your mind starts to change. And it's not just the content, the topics in your mind that changes, it's the very way that you see things and the way that you're looking. Kay has done a lot of work on mindfulness and also thinking about how when we look at Buddhist monks or people who've meditated for a long time, we actually see change in their neurological structure. So it gets more of a complicated answer, but yes, it's acquired, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can come in and out of these different structures of mind depending on how fixed your society is in the way that they're approaching your body. Keya?
Yes, I think interesting question, very perfect answer, Jen. I will also just say maybe in relation to the question is that definitely I think very few, if at all, feminists are essentialist. But in terms of, how does then social construction work, right? I think Jen, did a great job. What I would just add there would be that actually our way of conceiving these questions and these topics allow philosophy of mind to consider questions of transformation, right? What happens? What are the conditions of mental transformation, social transformation? So in such ways, some ways I would say that these are actually important questions for us, how social construction work, and actually considering or approaching the questions the way we do, allow philosophy of mind to consider some questions that have really, long-lasting and important implication. Yeah.
Thank you. I actually have a question that my colleague gave me. He wasn't able to be here today, but he sent some questions in. So sorry, I'll read his question. And he quotes from the introduction, feminist criticisms of naturalism emphasize the pragmatic concern that science is not a socially and politically neutral enterprise. And the question, would you mind speaking to that just a bit? Naturalism as a framework and its impact on our understanding of minds, bodies, etc. It seems like it could be important to note and reflect upon this at a STEM institution.
Yes. So that's a very big question, and we spent a lot of time talking about naturalism and how to approach this, because in traditional philosophy of mind, most traditional theories of mind are all naturalist theories. So there's not a lot of debate in traditional philosophy of mind about whether the mind is physical or not. Almost all contemporary philosophers of mind say that the mind is physical, and then it's just a question of how is it physical, or in what ways is it physical. Now, this can get in tension with feminist views, because if we're saying that the mind is physical, and then what we mean by physical is simply whatever science tells us the mind is, or whatever science tells us whatever neural state is activated at a particular time, this doesn't give us a lot of room for, one, the interpretation of science. And many feminist philosophers of science have pointed out that there's all kinds of social biases that affect the interpretation of data, especially interpretations about women's bodies and women's minds as well. So, for example, famous article in Feminism, Emily Martin's The Egg and the Sperm, talking about how these cells are attributed very robust masculine and feminine stereotypes when they're actually cells. So there's something about the social context of the scientist that is interpreting the data in a certain way and then presenting it as if it's fact and the truth of the world, when it's really a contingent social interpretation. So this is something that has to be worked out in the future integration of these fields, I think, is how we're going to understand physicalism. And also some of the chapters in the book talk about how should we treat science, right? Do you treat it as just fact, or do you have to do more interpretation? And most of the feminists are saying there needs to be conjoined interpretation of philosophy and science. We can't just take any scientific data as a fact and say that that's how the body is. Keya?
Yeah. Yes, and that's a huge question, Jen. I mean,
Yes.
as you noted, I think maybe one way I would just add to Jen's, it would be that if naturalism is often viewed, and I think for good reason, as taking the nature as a given, as Jen was saying, right? If you take nature, data, whatever we think of objective, right? Objectively given. So data, nature, your experiment results, so naturalism, if naturalism is thought of that way, where we think of something as devoid of any values, then I think naturalism is problematic. But and I think both Jen and I are trying to hint at that actually there's a lot of literature and there are a lot of different kinds of naturalism now being developed, non-reductive naturalism and so on and so forth. So I think we have tried in our book to not just speak of naturalism as one, like one kind, but a more nuanced way. But there are definitely some worries if we think of naturalism in a very sort of straightforward way.
Thank you so much. And do we have any other questions in the room or on Zoom? And we are coming up on 1 o'clock. So thank you again so much, Jen and Keya. The book is available on the library website if you wish to read it, and in many fine retailers. And congratulations again on the book, and thank you so much for your talk today.
Thank you, Paige, and everyone for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, and having me especially from Join.
Yes, thank you for joining from so far away.